Okay, so yes, I wanted to talk about landing navigations and exposing that to RUM. So the reason I started to look into that is that I started to dig into SPAs and MPAs, so single page apps and multi-page apps, and looking at their performance along with Michael here. And what we noticed is that in terms of performance characteristics, we have two very distinct types of navigations. Uh, we have landings and like what we call landings and follow-ups. So landings is something that we define as a first navigation in a browsing session. That's the browsing session is an HTML concept that defines the set of essentially the session history that happens inside a tab. And it very much correlates with what we define as a landing. So either cross-origin navigation or a navigation where the user arrived at the page from a different origin, or navigation that was, for example, opened in a new tab. And one distinct characteristics of those navigations is that they cannot be developer intercepted. So that essentially means that, at least at the moment, when we're looking at MPAs and SPAs, SPAs only have landing navigations, at least for the SPA part of their site. And MPAs have a mix of landing navigations versus follow-up navigations. And like I said, we see very different performance characteristics. And I wanted to also have a shiny graph to go along with that slide, but I started working on my slides earlier today, and it was too late to run necessary queries. But at least like when we're looking at internal Chrome metrics, we see clear differences in various performance metrics, for example, in code vitals passing rates between those two different navigations on the same site. Thinking about that, it seems like something we want to expose to RUM. And that would enable RUM providers to split on that navigation type as a dimension, because landing and follow-up performance can sometimes be traded off. Sometimes we can do more work for landing navigations where it will save us work on follow-up navigations, for example, prefetching. And also being able to split on that dimension can help reduce noise and clarify the data if it's bimodal, because you have these two different types that can enable you to split those two modes. And then for MPA and SPA comparisons, if RUM providers were to try to compare like broader industry trends, only landings are apples to apples comparison when doing that comparison. So that would enable RUM providers to do those kind of splits and generate those kind of reports. And then potentially more important, developers would be able to then monitor migration between architectures. So for example, during rewrites, if you are rewriting your app and moving from an MPA to an SPA, or the other way around, you want to make sure that during that process, you're not losing performance, you're not making your site slower. And that would enable developers to monitor that migration, to slowly roll out that new architecture and keep track of landings on both sides of that architectural fence. Theoretically, that information is already exposed through session storage. So whatever API shape we end up with is theoretically polyfillable using session storage, only that session storage is slow and busted, and we don't want anyone to use it because it's a synchronous API that accesses the disk, and disks are bad for synchronous access. So theoretically, it can be polyfilled. We don't really want people to do that. At the same time, in my view, I think it means that it's safe to expose that information. I haven't run it through security folks just yet, but it seems like something that's already exposed to the platform. So in terms of what I thought of for API shape, we have, this is essentially all this is the performance navigation timing entry. What I thought is simply adding a Boolean for landing or whatever other name we will land on. Apologies. And that would, in my view, mesh well with the concept of this being tied to a single navigation, and won't require any updates once we also start reporting other types of navigation, because this will be tied to the navigation entry, which represents this info. And also, there's a link here to Sketch PR I put together today. It's still like work in progress, but in terms of complexity, it seems relatively easy to add, just like because these concepts are already defined, even if not exported in HTML. So maybe we'll need to add the concept of landing to HTML, or we can export those concepts and use them in navigation timing directly, but generally it's already relatively well defined. Okay, and with that, let's discuss.